So it's just on the hour right now, and we're about to begin the OpenChain contribution specification kickoff call. Before we begin the call formally, I'm going to put up our antitrust policy notice. All of the Linux Foundation meetings are held under this policy. You can find the full policy on our website. If you're from a Linux Foundation member company, ask our counsel, Andy Updegrove, any questions regarding the policy itself. Now, we're going to give it one more minute for people to dial in, and then we'll jump into this kickoff call, which will describe how we create standards, and it will talk about the standard we're looking at creating next, the contribution specification. All right, let's dive in. This call is intended to be a landmark of sorts. It will be available online for our community to review. That will be useful for people who are working with us on the contribution specification, but it will also be useful for people who are more generally interested in how OpenChain makes specifications and how that can impact their own projects around the world. This type of kickoff call is intended to ensure that people, either native or non-native speakers of English, can understand how and why we are doing something. One of the most important things that we will cover in a moment are the processes to manage ourselves so that everyone has the knowledge about how to interact and the parameters of where we interact. Very specifically, we will be looking at the OpenChain processes for developing specifications. And I will share my screen to show that now in just one moment. Okay, the screen share should be switching over momentarily. And here we are in the OpenChain FAQ. For the live audience in the chat, you'll find a link to this particular page with this particular area opened up. The most important point for people is that this project has 4 guiding principles when it comes to developing a standard. This means that they set the parameters for how we talk about things. And that is extremely important when there are topics which can have many opinions and many different understandings of scope. For us, we very clearly set our reason and our scope in strategy. So our reason for working on standards is to build trust around the open source supply chain. So everything we do is about building trust in the open source supply chain. Anything that is not about building trust is outside of scope. Anything that is inside that is potentially going to be included in our discussions. The second principle is that less is more. We want to make sure that what we do is effective, but we always want to make sure that what we do is simple. So when we design a standard, we're doing something to define the key requirements, quality program. So we're designing standards that support programs delivering quality around something in trust in the supply chain. We focus on solving real pain points in the supply chain. In other words, we focus only on solving real problems. That has implications. We welcome ideas and suggestions and innovation, but the things we include on standards are only those things solving current, identifiable problems in the supply chain itself. That means we are not normative. We are not going to be focusing on things that are not based on the supply chain. That's very important. There are lots of great ideas and suggestions for building the future, but a lot of those are based on opinions. We're not really interested in that. We're interested in solving industrial supply chain challenges. Continuing that, we limit our specifications to what and why. We avoid how and when. Now, to explain that more clearly, what and why is the broad strokes. Saying, for example, have a process here. How and when would be describing the specific content decisions of the process. This is very important, and it's related to the idea of normative decisions. We identify where a solution can be built, and we help set the framework for that. But we ensure that companies can choose the implementation method they want and the process content they want. This is vitally important for companies of all sizes in all markets. And of course, we're open for everyone to participate and contribute. That's very important. You don't have to be an OpenChain member company to help build the standards. You don't have to be a Linux Foundation member to build the standards. You just turn up. So those 4 guiding principles, the foundation of this is that we are building trust in the supply chain. We do that by defining the key requirements of quality programs. We only focus on solving real-world problems. We do not limit implementation choices, and we do not mandate specific process content. In other words, we are high level, practical, and non-prescriptive, non-normative. That's a very important set of walls around us. They purposefully limit our sphere of action because when we talk about anything, like let's say license compliance or security or contribution, there are a million ideas, and we have to set boundaries so that we address them in a focused way. Our job is not to solve all the problems in the world, but to make a significant contribution to some key challenges. I'll pause here and check if anyone has any questions about those guiding principles. For reference, we have used them since the beginning of the project, and we have found them successful in building now 2 ISO standards. But that doesn't mean you should not have questions about it. So if you have any questions, please let me know now. Okay, if there's no questions, we'll look at the actual development process. We're at stage 1. Hold a kickoff call to talk about our guiding principles. So of course, a lot has happened before this call. We've had the idea of a contribution specification, and we've had some discussion around it. That has been captured on GitHub, and we will review that in a few minutes. But now we're formally doing it. This is where we start developing the specification, and this kickoff call sets the tone for our approach, explaining our methodology and our aspiration. Moving through this, we basically edit the spec. We develop it via our monthly calls and our specification mailing list. This means that there's a clear way for people to contribute and share ideas. This standard will be developed alongside our other standards in the same place, in the same way. We will be recording feedback on GitHub. This means that we will have a repository and we will record the information captured on our calls and our mailing list there. Once we are ready and we have a draft spec, we put it on GitHub and we continue to iterate until we have a target completion date that will be created in collaboration with our chairs of the specification. Once they set a target completion date, we will have 6 weeks for public comments. That's where there is a completed draft specification and people can make, what would I say? People can make some information, contributions regarding typos and other major issues they see in the document. They can send those in for 30 days, and then the final 2 weeks will be used to have a freeze period where we will review all of the final suggestions and comments that come in. The public comments period is really intended to take the final draft document and pick up any big problems. But if there are some serious challenges or issues flagged in the public comments period, we will potentially delay the publication of the specification, which would mean that we might take a serious concern and re-edit the document to include that if necessary. But that itself has some rules. If we make a change because we see a significant issue may exist, we have a new public comment period and a new freeze period. If we can't build consensus that the document looks okay, then we will complete cycling until everyone says we think we're there. Once this is done, so once we have a draft document, once we've gone through a public comments period and a freeze period, and the people involved in our specification list and monthly calls are happy, we send the completed draft spec to the OpenChain steering committee. And that's when they will review it and decide if it will be an OpenChain standard or not. In other words, once we edit on our calls and our mailing list, once we do a public comment period and a freeze period, and presuming that we build consensus on the final document, that then goes to a final step, a steering committee that votes on this draft standard and decides if it graduates as an OpenChain standard or not. This has some implications. One of the main ones is that our work creating a new draft standard does not guarantee that that standard will be released as an official OpenChain standard. We're drafting a document collaboratively in a way that's open to everyone, but the final determination, the final vote of whether that goes out as an OpenChain standard lies with the steering committee. That said, the draft standard will be available to everyone. It will be on GitHub. And regardless of whether we decide in the very last stage to make it an OpenChain standard or not, it will be available to the market as a collected knowledge of what we saw with contribution or other topics. So in case you're wondering, why is this development process so rigid? Why does it do things like have freeze periods and then potentially going through comments again, freeze periods? That is to set the parameters for how people can contribute and when they can expect to see major modifications. The next few months, as we get a draft document into GitHub, are when we expect the brainstorming and we expect the majority of development. The public comments is really just to catch typos and so on, unless there is a huge issue which is brought to our attention. The freeze period is just where we look at literally the typos and other issues and integrate them in the document. It's a very slow, steady process. And it's very clear what we expect during each point. In the initial, we expect ideas. In public comments, we expect minor notes. Freeze period, we double check that we don't have typos or other weird problems. And then we look for consensus. If consensus cannot be found, we do another public comment and another freeze period, and we reiterate until eventually we have consensus. In practice, we expect to edit the document and have a very gentle public comment period of 30 days and a freeze period of 2 weeks without any particular issues, and hopefully a nice smooth run to getting this document over to the steering committee for formal review and vote. That's our process. Pausing here to check if there's any questions or concerns.
I actually have a question.
Cornelius, good morning.
Good morning. I have a question about the role of GitHub. You said GitHub is used to record the stuff which is happening on the mailing list and so on. What's the preferred channel for discussion and comments? Is it also okay to just comment on GitHub, or would you keep GitHub really just as a recording place?
It's such a good question, Cornelius. I think what I'd say is that ultimately the monthly community calls and specification mailing list are designed to be a sort of organic place for people, but the recorded feedback is GitHub issues. So my interpretation and our current practice is basically that if you want to say something in a recorded way, you can go direct to having a GitHub issue. And then we'll just raise that at the monthly call or on the mailing list. So I would say that the feedback on the calls and mailing list is intended to provide a zone for specification that requires no particular expertise, including how to use GitHub at all. But we record all the feedback. And for that reason, you're very welcome to open new issues on GitHub and do your feedback that way.
Okay.
To add clarity, I will update the community development process to note on point 2 that you can go directly to GitHub issues and submit them. The reason that it isn't there at this juncture is that in the previous standards development, we focused on the monthly calls and mailing list. And using GitHub, it was simply a repository of knowledge. But clearly our community is more and more likely to actually be fine with submitting issues themselves. So I'll add that to point 2 here on the community development process. The intent, of course, was always that people could use GitHub to do so. It was just that they did not do so. And you know, to be honest, when we started doing this in 2017, our basic audience was going back and forth on a Word document. So it was a different time. Okay. So what I've done now is I'm going to update that, and this will ensure that we have clarity regarding people can use the GitHub as well as the mailing list for adding this. And to confirm this, I will just double check that everything looks okay here.
Shen-san, I have one question about the mailing list.
Of course.
Yeah. So already we have the specification mailing list, and
Yeah.
the mailing list means that's mailing list, or you will prepare the different independent mailing list for contribution specification.
It will be the same specification mailing list. So we will use the same list for all of our standards.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that, and the reason that we've used one mailing list since the beginning, is that we want to make sure that people from ISO or other standards organizations can go back to one place and see every discussion. Now, when we started, we only had one standard, and therefore it was pretty simple, one specification list. Now we are at 2 ISO standards, and we're about to start making a 3rd standard with contribution. There would have been the potential to have multiple mailing lists, but when we started on security, we decided just keeping it in one area was the most efficient thing. That would leave a very simple record. And if we ever had to move provider, like right now we use groups.io, we would just need to export carefully one repository, one mailing list archive and put it somewhere else instead of having multiple fragmented lists. So we're really thinking about the long term, where 10 or 15 years from now, someone might want to check out, when did we schedule the kickoff call for the contribution standard? And they can know that they just look at this one archive and they'll see all of OpenChain's standardization work. This also has implications because if anyone sends a mail to another mailing list, that's not officially part of feedback. So if people send a mail to a country team list or similar, that's still not officially part of the feedback to a standard until it gets to the spec list or a call or onto GitHub. Cornelius, I see you're unmuted. Do you have a follow-up?
Okay.
Just one thought which came into my mind. Creating issues is one way of providing kind of initial feedback, but we also have the comments in issues and also specifically the comments in pull requests, so for really discussing concrete text changes. How are we going to use these?
That's a really good question. So what we've done with the standards is we have never encouraged pull requests. And the reason is we don't want to fragment copyright. We need to move our copyright on the standards from OpenChain over to the Joint Development Foundation over to ISO. So we actually don't want pull requests. And when it comes to people leaving comments on issues or so on, I would say I would expect that if we mention issues that they naturally understand that we're fine with comments on issues. But with the pull requests, we actually don't want them on the standards. We want pull requests on all the reference material. That's all CC0. But the standards need to have more limited copyright grants. So we use a CC license, but ISO uses all rights reserved. So technically speaking, we focus on having the spec chair or Linux Foundation staff look at comments and integrate them. And the spec chairs need to sign a copyright transfer so that we can make sure that Joint Development Foundation and ISO get it as well. Actually, you've touched on a very important issue for standards development that's very, very, very dangerous. To balance being open for everyone to participate and contribute, but to go all the way to something like ISO, we have to make sure that the copyright is clean. And that means that there's some choices to make about how we are open. In our case, we take feedback from people, but we don't take written sections of text. So the idea here is that we capture the feedback and we try to channel it in GitHub issues, but we don't want pull requests or anything like this. But I want to take your comment into account. Here it says we record feedback through GitHub issues for the relevant specification. I'm going to make a quick change, and just like the other change, it's not intended to change the meaning of what we're doing, just to clarify things. And I'm going to change it to say, we accept GitHub issues. My apologies. My little brain isn't working today at all. We record feedback through GitHub issues, and I'm just going to put this here, and their comments. Do you think I should add something that we do not encourage pull requests due to wanting to keep the copyright limited?
Yes, because otherwise it would be very confusing. I learned a lot now. Thanks for explaining that, Shane. But as an open source, like if you assume other open source oriented folks come in, this is a very particular difference from, let's say, the assumed default. So I would really appreciate making that clear to everybody. Just my 2 cents.
Yep.
Yeah, agreed. Same thinking here.
Yeah, good morning from my side. Yeah, I would agree here as well. It should be clarified that pull requests won't be accepted.
Okay. I'm just adding that to point 3. I'm going to say we do not accept pull requests due to requirements to keep copyright. So I'm trying to think of the best phrasing. Ownership limited and allow easy transfer to international standards organizations. Yeah, it's a peculiar thing. And actually, when we first started developing, no one got to touch the document except our chair of spec, Mark Giese. So even myself or and when I say our chair, Mark Giese, myself or the chair of the OpenChain board didn't get a copy of the document either. Only Mark Giese, the chair of spec, got it. Now, with using GitHub instead of a Word document, we're moving into a slightly different zone because times have changed. And we are putting our document on GitHub, albeit by saying this document is under this license, and that license, is more restrictive. What I've done here is I've said we do not accept pull requests due to requirements to keep copyright ownership limited and allow easy transfer to international standards organizations. What I have not done there is gone into the details of it. I don't want to make the development process incredibly wordy, and it's already huge. I'm assuming that if someone has concerns about that, they'll raise it, and then we can explain in detail why. I just wanted to see if you think that's a reasonable way to manage this.
That's fine for me. And I guess for the reason of being very open and keep the process simple and approachable, we also don't you don't look into things like CLAs or anything of that sort.
Right. No. No, we don't. Otherwise, we'd end up having to maintain a repository of data and so on. That
Yeah,
would.
that's fine. It's fine. Just wanted to ask. I agree. Thanks.
No, it's a great question, and it would be a lot simpler if we weren't in the situation that we're fitting into other people's processes, and ultimately now we're an ISO standards creator. So we have to get from Creative Commons attribution to completely all rights reserved as smoothly as possible. So our standards are always CC attribution, and that's how we bring them out. And this, of course, means that you can pass the document onwards, but it's not remixable. But that gets narrowed all the way down to all rights reserved as soon as it gets to ISO. And we want to be able to do that without having to have a maintenance burden. apart from just getting our chairs to do a copyright contribution if they've made any original contributions to a standard. By the way, one reason this call is super useful is because, as people can probably guess, having gone from one standard to two to now today literally working on three, it's entirely possible OpenChain will make more standards in the future. So, we do want to make sure that these little tweaks on language and clarity keep things as clear as possible, because who knows, we might be developing several standards in parallel in the future. And at the very least, we are developing updates to our existing security and license compliance standard, and now we'll be doing contribution in parallel. So we want people to be able to go, what's going on? Come to the FAQ, see why we reject normative ideas, see when they should contribute and when they should just send in minor editorial, and then see when consensus happens and how. So this is all about setting those parameters. Endo-san, my apologies. You unmuted yourself earlier, perhaps with a follow-up to your first question. I just wanted to swing back and check if you had any addition on your first question or other comments.
No problem. Thank you.
Okay, great. So those are the parameters, and thank you very much for clarifying things. Adding that we do not accept pull requests is a good add. Making sure that it's clear people can actually open issues on the GitHub repository instead of monthly calls or spec mailing list stuff, good add. And in practice, we're in that transition period of trying to make sure that we can explain things as clearly as possible. What we'll do now, moving here, is we'll talk about specifically what we're doing with this new standard, the contribution spec. So there was a thread saying, what if we took one of the important final sections of our license compliance standard about contribution and expanded it? Our license compliance standard basically said, have a contribution policy, and then left it at that. But a lot of companies are putting in place contribution processes. So the question was, well, do we identify what those processes are? Not the content, but what the processes may be, the minimum processes for a quality contribution program. And ideas flew in. So we have an initial thread discussing it. We have first topics for discussion, and we have all the open issues for review. Let me copy and paste all of this text into the chat for people who want it. And let me dive right in and show you some of where we were at and why that matters. Oops, that's the wrong one, isn't it? Yes, my apologies. Okay, so opening up, Jimmy had an idea with Matthew and myself about a contribution spec, taking section 3.5 of the OpenChain license spec and talking about more detail. Beyond having a contribution policy, what do you need to do to have a quality contribution program? What's the minimal that needs to be in place? So, it obviously suggests that taking the beginning of what we have here and building out is the foundation. The beginning would be to say there needs to be a policy. The next step would be to start describing the processes that are required after you have a policy written. Now, this actually provoked quite a lot of discussion. We had confirmation that there's a market need. Mary from Continental jumped in and said it would be helpful. We had suggestions of data points. Anna from To-Do brought in some information. We had some great information just listed from SAP. And then the discussion pushed up on some of the boundaries I touched in earlier. Anna brought up some to-do group material that talked about how contribution workflows can go. Something that To-Do is working on, the 6 principles of open source engagement. And she suggested maybe this could be included in our spec. Now, when this was suggested, it provided an excellent example of how we can take information, but also narrowly scope it. Again, this is all in the same issue 1. And, we were talking about how we develop best practices. We're carefully focused, but also very importantly, we are scoped not on how you do something, but what. So when it comes to anything that looks normative, we don't want that. So we can look at information people have, but we have to be very cautious about choosing anything that does look normative. And here we go. I wanted to flag one. There was something in the to-do group material that looked pretty normative. This example, I'm flagging, was saying put the community first. As a corporate developer, your role is not to push your company's roadmap onto a project, but contribute from your experience with other community members towards solving the problems the community is facing. That is not a bad idea, but it is a normative idea. It's saying your contribution should have this motivation. So those are examples of how we had some great comments in, some great material to chew over, but also some things to filter with our rules. And that takes us to our second item, issue 2, where now that we know that there's a bunch of material to review and there's some filters to apply, what are the initial topics we need to discuss? And Jimmy tabled a bunch of those. So Jimmy tabled a bunch of topics to discuss that would be, I think we'd say, high level and either non-normative or designed to flesh out what is normative and what's not. And we always want to flesh that out and choose the dry, basic overview as opposed to anything that's detailed about how or normative. So he says it might be useful to discuss, internal approvals for a developer to contribute code. Is open source strategy included in the contribution space? Just for relevance here, that is showing the polar opposite of someone saying what a corporate developer's role is to do, and in this case, not follow their company's roadmap, as opposed to saying, is contribution tied to open source strategy? So it's about identifying then, does a company say you can only contribute if it matches our strategy? Or does a company choose to say developers may contribute based on their interest, XYZ? Regardless, this stuff should be documented and communicated. Should we include processes to deal with unauthorized code contributions? Should we include requirement that processes check for things like CLAs? Where's the copyright going? Is it goable? Is it going somewhere wrong? Should there be metrics and follow-up to see if contribution is meeting goals or contravening them? And, should there be something where a receiving org, a project, can double check validity? In other words, if company A contributes to project B, but project B might have a concern, can they go back to company A to double check validity and internal approvals? So, these are the initial comments for discussion, the type of things. What are the internal approvals? Is business strategy included? How do we deal with unauthorized contributions? Is there a process for checking copyright assignment and so on? Are metrics included? And should the receiving organization have contact points as well? Just in the way in our license spec, we have the thing where you should have an external liaison to explain your license compliance. Do we want to have an external liaison to explain your open source contribution policy so the projects can swing back and check that everything looks good? Now, that type of material is almost a blank sheet and is very useful to get us sharing ideas. Jimmy, you're unmuted. Over to you.
No. I just wanted to make the point also that it doesn't really have to be a separate person, right? It could be the same person that's appointed as the contact, as long as sort of someone is. We don't necessarily want to create a huge burden. And these points were sort of bashed out late one evening when I had some time left over, and it's just a starting point for discussion. We could start the discussion anywhere else where people feel it's more appropriate. This was just sort of an idea to get us going. It's not necessarily the idea to get us going. So if people want to table other things, then I'm totally fine with that.
Absolutely. And Thomas, I do see your hand up, so I'll be swinging back to you in just a second. I just wanted to flag something first, which is that when we look at that basic information, when we're looking at those parameters of the type of topics that we normally cover, this is where we can go into pre-existing material, like the to-do group guide to outbound open source software. Excuse me. And we can start to check, how do they touch on these points? What type of information do they have? So that we can align with those approaches. We can make sure we don't contradict stuff that's out there. So everything is very compatible. Our high-level standardization process, which is normally very simple, very much designed to be solving the strategy pain points, the quality program pain points for an org, organically easily lead into more detailed information from organizations like To-Do Group, which have collected tons and tons of relevant material. Okay, Thomas, over to you.
So since we're talking about contribution specification, I would say stay in the specification space. So there's two things that basically I don't think is covered, which has always been a big gap. And I worked previously with Kevin when he used to work at Bloomberg on specifications. I would love if in this effort we could focus on like a specification that makes it, defines a way where, oh, I know Jimmy, but if I need to find who is doing open source at Ericsson, now I can use the to-do group context to find it. But it would be nice if there's like they do in, for instance, the CSelf spec, where they publish a well-known file where you can just look it up. So if I know Ericsson's domain, I can just automatically look up where the point of contact is, and specifying out maybe where Ericsson has basically their excerpt of their contribution process defined. So then there would not necessarily be an overlap with like other activities, but more a defined road in, similar to what kind of like what OpenChain does on specifying the compliance process. There's a lot of material out there on compliance processes, but with OpenChain, it was nicely like, no, these are kind of the checklist, the checkboxes that everybody agrees there should be a minimum. So I'm hoping in this spec we could do somewhere similar for contributing, where we say like, look, this is the minimum that your contribution process should meet. And this is a way how you can easily express, like OpenChain, to the outside that basically we meet this minimum. And this is the way how you can easily check that this contribution from my organization went through the minimum specification. It's the same way like we have at OpenChain, where if I want to know if an OpenChain organization is OpenChain kind of conformant, I can either find it on the website or they have a public external certifier saying that. That was my 50 cents.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, it's a very good point. And ideally, what we'll have here is a way to, in our view, have this very high level kind of dry approach to identify the minimal items you're doing. And one example here, I'm just pulling out the license compliance spec. You know, there's a thing with access which says have a publicly visible method for third parties to contact you and find out what's going on in license compliance. Now, we're not prescriptive if it's an email address or something else. We don't go that far down. We just say have this item in place. And ideally what would happen is that this contribution spec would set the framework and the tone so that you know that if company A is contributing to projects and is standard conformant, they use this standard, you know that they'll have these various things in place. They'll have a policy, they'll have, assuming we include, let's say, this is assuming we decided to include all of Jimmy's suggestions, we'd know that they tie their contribution to strategy. So they've got something about how it is relevant to their company. We know they've got processes for unauthorized contributions. We know that they have processes for copyright assignment. And we know that they have an external contact, which is the equivalent of exactly this point here. So we mightn't know if the contact is via email address or if it's on, let's say, the to-do group website, but we'd know it's out there. And we'd know that they should have a way to respond. So yeah, I mean, exactly, Thomas. We don't want to rewrite what other people are doing. In fact, you know, to be frank, we should be a way for people to begin getting the quality program in place and then to go to places like To-Do Group and fill out the details based on huge amounts of community knowledge consolidated. Some of that knowledge will be descriptive, like talking about, you know, all of the various details of how to do outbound. Some of it might be normative, like the discussion I flagged earlier, which is out of scope for us, saying what's kind of the best positioning for an individual developer for project relations, that kind of stuff. So what we do should ultimately be super high level, not reinventing the wheel, but providing a way to have a baseline for quality, and then for people to quickly dive deeper into places like the to-do group material and so on for details, the how. So we do what, big level, process management, trust and supply chain, and then people go to the how with things like the to-do group material. And we would then be focusing on having that baseline that you'd know if company A is contributing to project B, company A definitely does, assuming we included Jimmy's stuff, definitely does have a policy. It is going to have internal approvals. It's going to be tied to business strategy. So they'll have thought about it. They'll have thought about it. Unauthorized contributions and all of that will be dealt with, and there'll be a contact way. So if you're project B, you're worried that someone just maybe made an unauthorized contribution of what could be massive amounts of intellectual property, you can quickly contact the company and say, is that good? Jimmy, over to you.
I think that's a great summary. I just want to add another point as well towards that. This really, I mean, if you have projects where people are following this, assuming you take some of my suggestions here, that would indicate that when a company makes these contributions, they're in it for the long haul, right? Because it's tied to their strategy. It's sort of been approved internally. It's less likely to be a one-off thing. So
Yeah.
that would be an indication for the project itself that these might be long-term partners for us, but also for the consumers of that open source component or that open source project, that, oh, these companies are in here, they are contributing, they are conforming to the spec, meaning it's likely a long-term thing for them.
That's a really good point, Jimmy. And it leads to something which I think is vital. What we do in making standards is dry. And on this call, I must have said non-normative about 50 times. And the reason it's dry is because we're throwing out ISO standards, and these things will be in market for decades. So what we're trying to do is to set a framework that allows business process management to do better in open source, in trust in the supply chain. But the indicator is that if people start using these processes, they are up to something that is going to be sustainable in engaging with open source. If it's license compliance, we know that it's not a one-off, that they got a product out with license compliance. Security, it's the same. And contribution as well. This is an indicator that a company has tied contribution to their policy and their processes and their business strategy. And that has huge implications for people being sticky with open source and actually including it in a sustainable way. So while we're very dry building ISO standards, our goals naturally align with the fact that fundamentally everyone here thinks open source is a great idea. We want more people using it, and we want to encourage people to be real stakeholders, not just people who engage temporarily, not just take and go, but we want them to be part of the community. So we're trying to encourage that, and we do it within these firmly set parameters so that we get these long-term ISO standards. I saw both Cornelius and Jimmy put their hands up. Cornelius, you're first.
When looking at this issue, there's one thing which pops up in my mind, that contributions, there are two different directions of contributions. So one is, and I think that's what probably is the majority, an organization contributing to a project outside of the organization. So where it's all about the process to make sure you have the transparency, the rights, and so on. You make sure that your contributors are doing the right things from your organization towards the outside project. But we also have the other case where an organization is running an open source project and they are setting the rules for others to contribute to their project. So this is when the organization is the receiving part and not the sending part. I'm wondering actually how to distinguish that in the best way, and if this setting this process for receiving contributions is even in scope of the specification we are talking about here.
Cornelius, I think that's an excellent point, especially considering what we just saw with, for instance, HashiCorp and the relicensing of their code base. Yeah, I think it's in scope. Our standard is about contribution, not just inbound. We're not tied to that, or not just outbound. So I think it's in scope to have some part of this standard relate to what if you were soliciting contributions. And a lot of it's the same. It's like, have a policy, have processes, tie it to business goals, have a communication method. So I think calling out what if I was soliciting contributions, what are the processes I should have, I think that's in scope. Now, I think is not project things, so we'd have to throw it out there. But I would love, if you want to open an issue on that, or I can do it later as well, but I'd love if you did it. That would be something I think we should discuss, and I personally think it's in scope.
Okay, so I will create an issue about that.
That'd be fantastic. It's very timely. We've seen a lot of people running projects and code bases and relicensing recently. And it's fine for people to relicense, but it has significant implications for other parties on their decisions. And the fact that it's all ad hoc, people are essentially soliciting contributions, and there's no framework for what that means. There's no real there's no process management or market expectation per se. Everything is normative. Maybe we could help that if someone was using our standard maybe it would be likely they'd have a communication strategy for the solicitation of contributions and the sustainability of it. And that may assist in making the market more predictable for everyone else as well. This said, and this is a quick note, we don't want to be normative about people being able to own a project and then decide the project is changing totally. That's up to them. Market will decide. What we can do is we can suggest that, have a thought process behind it that's predictable, and that may lead to more certainty, which would lead to a market situation with more trust and therefore more engagement. What we couldn't do is tell people, for example, you must pre-communicate that you're going to relicense your code base 6 months in advance, blah, blah, blah. That's all how. We can't do that. But we can have a what, which is to actually have a thought process behind how you solicit and manage contributions. And that thought process inherently indicates that the company would be in a position, if they so choose, to communicate things in a manner that's very predictable against a standard. Jimmy, over to you. You're muted at the moment.
Wow, thank you. So there might be sort of another category as well, both the contribution and the seeking contributions to your project. But there's among the contributions, there's also different classes, or you could classify in different ways, right? You could have, say, for example, mere bug fixes. Should there be simpler processes for those, or do we want to provide for that in the specification? Or is that too normative, too descriptive? I don't know, but I think there's value in recognizing that there are different kinds of contributions, even where you are actively contributing to a project. It's either very minor or be big feature drops that you're doing. And they might require slightly different touches. So at least we should provide for that opportunity or that possibility within the spec.
Absolutely. I think we're touching on point 4 that you brought up here, which is you were talking about things like check and get signatures for CLAs. And then I pulled that out and just said it's about copyright. So I think that would fit under that. Potentially there could be a section saying, have a process to determine if contributions meet your threshold for requiring copyright approval. And we could stop there. So we've set the what. And then the how could be a company X in, let's say, Sweden determines that under 8 lines on a bug fix is not copyrightable for us. So essentially, we don't care. And if the developers are sending in a bug fix of 8 lines or less, go ahead. There's no need for additional approvals if you meet that parameter. But if you cross that, if it's 9 lines, you need to get approval. Just as an example. Okay, so Jimmy and Mary have their hands up. Jimmy first, then Mary.
Mine is an old hand, sorry.
Okay, Mary.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly.
Yes, I'm thinking this is a very good initiative for thinking about take this as a standard. From my aspects, I'm thinking of this can reduce or improve this open source project, the quality, both from license and the security aspects. But also, when we're talking about the what, I'm just thinking, since we recently released the open source project, we're talking about the detailed stuff. For example, you need to have this maintainer who need to continuously maintain this project in your company. And that kind of requirement we don't have any in place today. So each company decide if they will have the maintainer or not. And for example, besides of this global licensing and security, patents, legal, as well as this export control and data protection areas. So all of this is in this what scope in this specification. That's my kind of comment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we need to have somehow ways to touch on these topics like export control and so on. So, I mean, our challenge really will be to brainstorm language and then to double check that we're not contradicting what other people have said, like to do group. So my basic suggestion will be that we're going to start editing this on the calls next month. But we have to start filling out a potential draft document and then iterating and iterating and iterating. So for each of the topics you raise, my suggestion is to open an issue. And then on our first call, we can start doing it. So for instance, one issue could be saying that when a company determines the process for unauthorized open source contributions or similar, they'll need to double check export control. And you know, to put the topics on your head, the concerns in your mind into issues, and then we look at that, we look at the other suggestions, and we formulate draft language, and then we double check the formulated language if it makes sense, and we double check it against other things like the to-do group material, like the SAP material, and that's how we iterate and try to cover everything. Yeah, Mary's point, sorry, Endo-san is pointing out that we have to consider business strategy, technology strategy, ownership of code, trade secrets. Yeah, and that we have to define the scope of this spec at first. Absolutely, Endo-san. So, I mean, to put into context, what I think we should be doing is that with very complex things like this, we simply refer that you need to think about it. We don't attempt to define the processes for trade secret management or HR or tax. We just make a note that, you know, you should have a process to deal with unauthorized open source contributions, comma, taking into account your business requirements on issues of ownership, trade secrets, and export control, etc. And just have a line like that. And that throws the responsibility for determining the how over to the companies. But we've set the context that, by the way, if someone is contributing code to an open source project, think about unauthorized. And the details of what is unauthorized for you depend on you. But you need to think about it because it's not just someone contributing to some magical domain where it doesn't matter. This will have business implications. So, very valid points, very valid points. So Mary, the issues you've raised, I'd love if you would consider recording some on GitHub and, you know, Endo-san, the scoping, absolutely. What we want to do is to look at the issues people have and to refer to the big picture. Here, for example, all of the items you mentioned basically fall under unauthorized or authorized. So we say determine that. And if that statement is enough to cover those use cases and the how follows, then we've done our job. We've done the what. And the how is working out the details of export control, HR, tax, etc. That's not our responsibility. I hope that makes sense. But we need to, yeah, we need to find out what people's problems are. And then we do the big picture what, and it's up to them to do the how. In this case, defining what we're up to, the scope of this spec is to think about contribution in the context of building trust in the open source supply chain. So this is all about what do we need to build trust? And that for us probably boils down to make sure there's a policy, make sure it doesn't mess up intellectual property on your side, make sure that if people have concerns, they can come and check with you, roughly. And then everything we do is only solving real problems, and it's only about key requirements, and it's only about what. So we do not want to go into details. We don't want to get distracted. We always stay here. And anything else belongs elsewhere. It belongs, for instance, in to-do group to work out more details on the how. I hope that makes sense. And I hope it sets the context for how we work in a very high level and why we do it. Because otherwise we'd end up with extremely, very, very long standards that would be extremely normative and therefore would only apply to a very small subset of the tens of thousands of companies in the supply chain. Okay, we are over time and we've covered a lot of material. So I actually want us to wrap up there. We will be editing on our monthly calls and on GitHub and on the mailing list. I encourage you to record the comments and ideas that you've had today on GitHub issues. And I would be extremely appreciative of you doing that in advance of our September calls, because that will help us begin to put together a document. And as soon as we have that document, we can go and do things like look at what has a company like SAP done as they publish their description of contribution policy, processes, and management. What has a project like To-Do done? How do we make sure that our brainstorm fits into this existing market knowledge? And then we iterate and iterate for a few months, and then we have a draft spec, and then we do a public call for comments, and we see what the rest of the market thinks about it. Okay, obviously a lot of interest here, a lot of great ideas. We are so lucky that a ton of work has been done in this area already. I mean, you know, people like Cornelius and others have been involved in things like this outbound guide for software from To-Do that contains absolutely tons of data that we can use for our work. We're very fortunate. And what we do now is we take our blue sky, we make a very dry draft spec, make sure that it's narrowly scoped into our parameters, and we have that at the top funnel of companies making their strategy for open source contribution, get them started on the right path, and then we guide them into long-term community engagement so that companies are not just visiting, they are here because they know the value and they know how to approach things to, first of all, their expectations be met because they know what to expect. And second of all, the community's expectations to be met because they know how companies will act if they're using our standard. All right, everyone, any final comments, any other business? Okay. Thank you all. We're over time. Appreciate your time. Brilliant feedback. Look forward to next steps on the regular meeting. Take care. Have a beautiful day.